The females that take them all the time.
And is that why you're particularly fond of them, because the females are in charge?
Well, that's the way the glen runs. The females are in charge.
The females are in charge, definitely. And then you don't have the wee biting beasties as well.
You don't have the biting beasties. Believe us, when we're here and having to do our work in July and August, you get in and out as quickly as you can.
Midges?
Midges.
They become sort of desensitised to humans. But that's just with general people walking through and talking.
I know a few humans become desensitised to humans as well, but there you go.
As a child, I would have come down here because I just loved it. I just think it's a very magical place and very, very special place, and also it's very ancient looking.
Far across yonder blue lies a true fairy land, where the sea ripples over the shingle and sand, where the gay honeysuckle is luring the bee, and the green glens of Antrim are calling to me. Kenneth North is the aptly named songwriter who provided us with this archetypal emigrant's lament, as he yearns for the lush green glens that nurtured his soul in the days of his youth. Quite often such songs are written with a rosy hindsight that tends to embellish the scene somewhat. But I have to say, having spent a number of days in this one of the lesser known and perhaps less celebrated of the 9 glens, is that my entirely detached and objective impression is that it is indeed a true fairy land. Welcome to Glenshesk on the Antrim coast in the northeast corner of Ulster. It's the month of January in Glenshesk, so the honeysuckle and the bee are not much in evidence, and the weather is a fickle thing. But the midwinter light casts its own enchantment, accentuating the fine bone structure of the glen and the lean contours that will later be softened by summer's excesses. Because the 9 glens of Antrim share a common geological ancestry, we tend to think of them as one entity. But the danger in using a collective term like the Glens of Antrim is that we see only the family resemblances and fail to recognise the fact that each has its own distinctive character, its own individual history. Unlike its sisters, which all travel towards the Sea of Moyle in a general easterly direction, Glenshesk strikes out northward, as if intent on reaching Rathlin Island, a giant stepping stone on the way to the Mull of Kintyre and the Inner Hebrides of Scotland beyond. Just before it reaches the coast, the Glenshesk River joins up with the Carry and the Tow to form the Margie River, which flows into the sea at Ballycastle. And it's the Margie River that Rory McQuillan used to name the Franciscan friary that he established here round about the year 1500. If being a roofless ancient monument can be called a form of survival, then Bonamargie Friary has survived centuries of turbulent conflict, destruction, refurbishment and further destruction. Its ownership, more often than not, decided at the point of a sword, wielded more often than not by the hands of the warring clans of the McQuillans, the O'Cahans and the ultimate victors in the struggle for lordship of the Glens, the MacDonalds. Colin Breen is a maritime archaeologist based at the University of Ulster who hails from Cork originally. But he paints such a detailed picture of the life and times of Bonamargie Friary that you'd almost believe he was born in it. Colin, as I've said, specialises in maritime archaeology. So would he describe Bonamargie as a maritime site?
I suppose in many senses it is a maritime monument, not only just in terms of its geographical setting. You know, we're only about 200-300 metres from the sea here. We're sitting on top of a series of coastal dunes, but much more than that, it was a maritime monument probably in a metaphorical sense. We don't know a huge amount about the McQuillans, but we know that by the middle part of the 15th century they had essentially established themselves as the major dominant family grouping in this area. And like many of these Gaelic groupings, one of the big ways that they demonstrated their power, their prestige, their wealth, their status within the landscape was through the patronage of these types of places.
Yeah.
It's positioned within this fantastic valley surrounded by the uplands, looking out over the sea. And much more than that, it's looking out over towards Rathlin. It's looking out beyond towards Islay. And remember, Islay and the Scottish Islands, they represent the heartland, the homelands of many of these groupings that are subsequently involved in this site.
That's the thing you have to take into account, because their notion of geography is slightly different from our modern notion, because, okay, here they were at the edge of the North Antrim coast, but they felt themselves belonging more out to this maritime area out here, really, across to Scotland and so on.
I think that's exactly it. And it was very much this sense of interconnectedness, an interconnectedness that was drawn together by marine communication, by sea traffic, by sea travel.
But you could argue that it was that very interconnectedness with the Scottish coast that proved to be the ultimate undoing of the McQuillans. Throughout the early 1500s, they dominated the area east of the River Bann from their precipitous power base at Dunluce Castle further along the coast. But they were at constant and violent loggerheads with their neighbours the O'Cahans, who ruled the territory immediately west of the Bann. In 1544, the McQuillans invoked the Scottish connection. They invited the MacDonalds over from Islay to help them in their fight against the O'Cahans, and that, according to Colin, was a major strategic mistake.
They very quickly usurp the McQuillans. They take Dunluce Castle from them, and they also take this site. They take Bunamargy from them as well. Mm-hmm. And in later years, they actually build their family vault, and most of their early leaders, their big men, are buried here at this site. Prior to this, of course, most of these Scottish Gaelic lordships, they would have invariably been buried in Iona. But now we're seeing this kind of reversion back to this Irish mainland, this connection, this re-established, this reimagining themselves essentially as an Irish Gaelic lordship, and they now bury themselves within the Ulster landscape.
So that's got great symbolic value as well, in other words.
Oh, very much so. You know, the fact that they were no longer buried or commemorated in Iona, they're now buried here in Ulster is really important and hugely significant.
Bunamargy Friary then, founded originally by the McQuillans, was to become the final resting place of their arch foes the MacDonalds, who added their own ancillary chapel and vault in later years. But the whole site has to be seen as the result of fairly continuous evolution over the centuries, destroyed, abandoned, repaired and restored to altered use on a number of occasions. At one stage, an English garrison stabled their horses here. The Western Range, as it's called, was an afterthought, providing a cloistered area for prayerful Franciscan friars, one of whose guiding precepts was, "You will take nothing hence other than your deeds, nor can you prolong your life, nor evade death." That would have been a sobering thought for those warring chieftains, who nonetheless sought a kind of posthumous comfort by being buried in the earliest part of the building, the nave.
During the medieval period, it would have been the most prestigious place in the church would have been to be buried just in front or by the altar. Yeah. So the original altar, the priest would have stood just here in front of the eastern window. You know, of course, originally in the earlier church, the priest would have actually faced the east. They would have faced away from the congregation.
With their back to the congregation.
With their back to the congregation. Yeah. So the lords, the big people in society, it would have been the most prestigious thing to be buried in and around this area.
Right.
That went out of fashion later on. But this is probably the most interesting part of the site. It's probably got one of the most fascinating parts of the story. But this is the MacDonald Vault.
Right.
So if we opened this and we went down into it, now we would see a series of coffins.
Really?
When it was first looked at, probably scientifically in the 19th century, one of the big antiquarians went into the site and he recorded 6 coffins, two wooden coffins and a lead casket, a lead type coffin. And he could read the inscriptions at the time, and most of the later coffins, they were of the later Earls of Antrim, late 17th century, early part of the 18th century, and their wives. The wooden coffin, one of the decayed wooden coffins, probably held the body of Randall MacDonald, the first Earl of Antrim, died 1628. And then the lead casket, or the lead coffin as Biggar referred to it, probably held the body of Sorley Boy MacDonald, probably the most famous MacDonald, buried within this place.
Are they still in there?
They're still here. They're still here.
Right.
Remember, this is the living place. This is the burial place, the primary burial place of the MacDonalds of Antrim.
Of the MacDonalds. I suppose in strictly historical terms, the most important person buried here at Bonamargay Friary would be the famous chieftain Sorley Boy MacDonald. But talk to anybody who grew up hereabouts and they will tell you that as children, the person they chiefly associated with this place was a woman, Julia McQuillan, otherwise known as the Black Nun, whose ghost is said to haunt these ancient ruins. She certainly haunted their imaginations and ensured that nobody came here alone, especially after dark. This curious little headstone or cross centre with the hole in the middle marks the spot where she asked to be buried, near the church entrance, so that people could walk on her grave as a sign of her humility. But you weren't encouraged to stand on the 7th step of the stone staircase inside the friary, because you would be cursed and have visions of blood dripping, because that is where she met her death, murdered, we're told, by persons unknown. Julia McQuillan lived here as a recluse sometime in the 1600s, and she's reputed to have made a number of prophecies which have since come to pass. For instance, she predicted that a red-haired priest would be appointed here and be drowned in the sea the very next day. And precisely that is said to have happened in the early 1900s. And that a horseless carriage would fly over the forest. Some people swear she was referring to the arrival of the railway, which indeed took the route that she predicted. Also, that 2 standing stones in the area would come together, which they did after a fashion when they were building Ballycastle Harbour in the 1700s. The thing that strikes me about those predictions, or prophecies if you like, is that none of them appear to have come true in her own lifetime, nor in the lifetime of anyone who was around to hear her make such predictions. Which leads me to believe that it's easy to make predictions, as long as you don't put any kind of time scale on it. Well, I'm going to stick my neck out now and make a prediction within a time scale. I predict that before this hour is over, as we travel further up the glen, we're going to encounter something else that came over from the Scottish Isles and made Glenshesk their home. The Mahon-Sowe Alliance, when we come back. The scholars will tell you that Glenshesk means the barren glen. That doesn't sit too well with the people who farm its slopes. They prefer the Glen of the Sedges, pointing out its summer lushness and its winter promise of better days to come. Brian McCahan's sheep may need a helping hand at this barren time of year, but this flock have been wintering in Glenshesk for hundreds of years, nearly as long as the McCahans themselves. Not so these tawny little wildlings, brought here a few generations ago from the island of Sowe in the archipelago of St Kilda off the coast of Scotland. Brian and his wife Una and I are bringing them some feed to discover which is their stronger instinct, distrust of humans or hunger. I'm not sure what to do. And is there a hierarchy amongst them?
Very much so. Among the rams, there will be dominant rams. But actually, the leaders of the flock are female.
Really?
Which is very strange.
How does that work?
It will be the females will lead them to the sheltered ground in times of snow and storm.
Right.
And as they graze and go for fresh grazing, Joe, it's the females that take them all the time.
And is that why you're particularly fond of them, because the females are in charge?
Well, that's the way the glen runs. The females are in charge.
The females are in charge, definitely. So, I mean, how many would be there altogether? There must be 100.
Well, we would have about 150 on the farm.
All right.
But there would be about 100 in this particular group.
Right. Are they normally wary of people? You said they're kind of feral now at this stage, aren't
Well, these are Bronze Age sheep from about 5,000 years ago that remained on the island of Sowe and were never improved. So whenever you look at our modern blackface on the farm and other ewes, you can see the results of selective breeding.
Right.
But these have never been improved, and that's the beauty of them.
Right.
What we're very much doing here, Joe, is keeping a small pool of genes safe. The great grandparents of these sheep came off the island of Soay and came off St Kilda.
Right.
So these have remained pure ever since.
They would run, they don't sort of have that instinct to sort of flock, they spread and scatter all over the place. But with feeding them on a regular basis, they're actually curious and they'll hang around, whereas when they first came, you couldn't find them, they were everywhere.
They were just wild, in other words. Well, they're very patient as well, because they know we've got a bag of food here, but they keep running around and saying, when are you going to put it out on the plates for us, you know? So will we do something
on that note,
we?
we'll put it out.
Okay.
If you hold one end of the bag, that's it.
How am I doing?
Doing very, very well.
An actual shepherd.
With this being a hill farm, Joe, we wouldn't tend to be as generous with the feed now.
Am I too generous?
You're sort of giving them a week's doing
All
one
right,
go.
you fed me one time and you were very generous with your portions.
Sure. We always put on a wee bit of a show.
We'll do the other side.
Yes, Joe. Maybe you should do the other side now.
Okay.
Saying you're getting on as well.
I'll start up here. Whoever said counting sheep could help a body to sleep never met the McCahan Soay sheep, who seemed to enjoy mad buck leaps over the troughs as much as they enjoyed the food. Whilst, as Brian says, this strain of sheep have a direct line of descent from their Bronze Age ancestors, his own conventional herd, if I can so describe them, have no mean pedigree themselves. Sheep have no real interest in genealogy that I'm aware of, but if they did, then the ewes in this flock could trace their own ancestry back to the early 1600s, when McCahans first settled in Glenshesk. Unlike the sheep, Brian and his family are very conscious and understandably proud of their deep-rooted connection to this glen. You'll find McCahan homesteads scattered like Soays throughout the glen, and in Brian and Una's house you'll find remarkable pictorial evidence of the most recent century of their habitation of this place. Your family populated this place for centuries, really?
Yes, we came here as far as we can ascertain around the 1600s. And we've been here since, farming in this same farm, so there's a lovely sense of continuity. And these photographs help us connect in so well with those who've gone before. Actually, there's a wee story about how we came here, because in the 1500s there was a battle, you're probably aware, mentioned before, between the O'Neills and the MacDonalds, which the O'Neills won.
Right.
But subsequent to that, our understanding is that the O'Neills went over to Limavady and took Canes, O'Cahans, McCahans, and planted us over here to sort of keep an eye on the McDonalds. So that's how the family came to this area, and we've been keeping a tight eye for them ever since.
You're keeping an eye out
just,
for them?
Just looking across the glen.
Don't let them get stroppy on them.
No, we won't.
So you were originally O'Cahans and all, you're part of the O'Cahan?
Yes, part of
tribe
Cane,
and all
O'Cahan, McCahan in that
I see,
sense.
I was wondering about that. The collection of family photographs that Brian is showing me is remarkable in a number of respects. They were all taken by one man, mostly in the early 1920s, and they amount to a kind of chronicle of life in the Glens back in that decade. But there's an unexpected modernity to this photographer's skill. The pictures are informal, often catching their subjects off guard, capturing the moment and the mood, capturing, with great insight and affection, the sheer unself-conscious joy of living. First of all, 1920s, they had turkeys. A huge big turkey and a small child, and that was in 1920. And I love the way all of these have a wee comment written on. Was that yourself did that?
No, my great uncle John, Father John, whenever he was printing these photographs, would have put a very witty comment on most of them.
He was a priest, was he?
He was a priest. He
Right.
was ordained a priest, professor of Latin St Malachy's, and principal of the college for a number of years.
Yes.
So being a single man, he had a great interest in photography and time to indulge the hobby. Everything we see on the table here is a lovely legacy of photographs he left to us.
The other thing I was going to say is that there's a lovely mat print about these? Did he print these himself?
He printed
as
them
well?
all himself. He had his own dark room and printed all these photographs.
Right. So this is a whole archive, a family archive, but it's also a kind of a social archive too.
It is. That's what makes him so interesting, in that he was very interested in many subjects and recorded things on the farm and around North Antrim and beyond that. And socially and culturally, and historically as well.
Right.
It's a lovely legacy that he has actually left us.
So he would have been, I mean, few people back in 1920 around here would have had a camera. Would that be right?
That's very true. Few people would have. And I know that he'd have given many photographs to family members, cousins, friends, neighbours as well. So there are quite a few of his photographs in homes around this area and beyond that.
So this is only a part of the
It's
collection.
a very, very small part of it.
Well, he must have never have been without a camera in his hand.
Yeah, he was a man who travelled with it in his car, and on the slightest occasion or notion he just took a photograph, and we're so grateful for that now.
The other thing I was going to say is because, I mean, you've seen photographs, we all seen photographs, you know, taken in the 20s and even much later, and there's a terrible formality about them, with people who are standing very rigid and so on. He seems to have got people relaxed, off guard, you know, and not at all self-conscious.
Probably because he was from a farm and from Glenshesk here, he maybe connected well with people, and that gave him an opportunity to take better photographs.
There's a wee barefoot boy here pulling a cart of hay, and a younger child as well.
That's his younger brother, actually.
Right.
Yes, that's
and who's this?
Well, that's my father,
That's your
Kevin.
father?
In 1924, he's 4 years of age there, with the bare feet pulling the wee cart of hay. And my uncle Shan, God rest him, he died a few years ago, his younger brother by a couple of years. And we're just playing around on the farm when my uncle took a photograph. And it's a captivating photograph.
Isn't it just absolutely charming, isn't it, really?
And Daddy is now, thank God, alive and well at 94, 90 years later. And it's lovely to just look back. 90 years ago, exactly.
90 years ago, I'm thinking, those little Mahon boys would have been well warned not to play at a certain beauty spot on the Glenshesk River within wandering distance of their home. Quite apart from the danger posed by fast-flowing water, their parents would have been acutely aware of the mishap that had befallen another little boy some years earlier at this part of the river. Many people in nearby Ballycastle could recount details of that incident to you today, because the little boy in question grew up to become a very significant figure in Glen's folklore. One of Ballycastle's best-loved local heroes was a man called John Henry Macaulay. He was born sometime in the late 1800s here in Glenshesk. He died in 1937, but his fame still lives on because he will be forever associated, in a good way, with one of the town's great institutions, but also in an unfortunate way with one of the noted landmarks of the area. John Henry was gifted in a number of respects. He had great hands, as the saying goes, and became very proficient at wood carving, particularly bog oak carving. And his little animals and round towers and beautifully ornamented picture frames became so much sought after that he opened a shop on Ann Street in Ballycastle where he made a living selling his wares. And he called it simply the Bog Oak Shop. But John Henry was also a very talented fiddle player and an occasional songwriter. And he wrote the song that has become almost synonymous with the town of Ballycastle, or at least with one of its most famous cultural events, the Owl Lammas Fair. Both these accomplishments, the bog oak carving and the fiddle playing, required long hours of practice, long years of dedicated application. But then John Henry had a lot of time on his hands, due mainly to that unfortunate encounter he had with this landmark, the big bridge that straddles the steep banks of the Glenshesk River. To get the full story of John Henry Macaulay and the Glenshesk Bridge, I'm going to be consulting another member of the Mahon clan. The joys and sorrows of Henry's Step, when we come back. On any given day, Niall Mahon is much more likely to be making his way through the crowded streets of Derry, where he manages the affairs of the Playhouse Theatre, than pushing his way through the thickly wooded banks of the Glenshesk River. But this is where he grew up and where he still feels very much at home. here at this magical place, as he describes it, where he and his brothers were allowed to play. We'll get around to John Henry Macaulay's association with the bridge above this pool presently. But good manners dictate that I first allow Niall, with his customary enthusiasm, to extol the qualities of what is known as Henry's Step.
As a child, I would have come down here because I just loved it. I just think it's a very magical place and very, very special place. And also it's very ancient looking. This is ancient woodland. I mean, we're in an area where the woodland's been here for centuries, and Breenwood, you know, the oldest oak forest in Ireland, is only a few hundred metres on up the river here.
Yeah.
So it's just a very, very, very special place. And even as an adult now, I'd come down here often, simply even to photograph and simply for a dander. I mean, it's a lovely, lovely special.
And you have wildlife here as well.
We have.
You're famous for the squirrels, the red squirrels.
Yes, the red squirrels, literally just beside us here too. But also we've got pine marten. We also have buzzards, which have been here for years. Also, because of the concentration of sheep, we have a lot of foxes around us here.
But it's interesting as well, you're talking about the native species.
Yeah.
Macahons are native species too.
We are.
You're here an awful long
Yeah,
time.
the Macahons have been here from around the 16th century, and that's quite a long time. And it's mainly, there's Macahons, there's also McBrides, Blacks, and other well-known families that would live around the Glens here too.
Right. So you're very, very familiar with this area. Now, the most striking, obviously man-made thing we can, in fact the only man-made thing we see around here is this marvellous big arch of a bridge in front of us.
Yes.
And that goes right back to the same time they were building the coast road, is that right?
It does. That dates back to 1846. The man actually who built it was a guy called William Bald, and of course he is known for the biggest civil engineering project at that time, which is the Antrim Coast Road. But what's unusual about this bridge, it actually has a carving at the very top of it, a wee man in a kilt, and that carving is on either side of the bridge. Probably the time of the bridge somebody decided they would
just for a bit of fun?
For a bit of fun, but it's lovely, and it's the only bridge I'm aware of in the Glens that has this carving, and it's just a lovely, majestic old bridge. It's known locally as the Big Bridge because it is a big bridge.
Big tall bridge because it's a big steep glen.
It is.
And at this point anyway.
Yep.
And invariably, when local people talk about the Big Bridge, they will also tell you the story of John Henry Macaulay, who grew up on Clare Farm nearby.
When he was a young child, he came down one day on his way to school, and the boys were playing, and they were having a game of kind of dare to see how far they could jump from the top of the bridge onto the bank. He went actually too far, and he jumped and badly injured himself and actually crippled himself permanently. And what then happened was that Mrs. Cuppage, who they were the landlords here in Glenshesk, she took pity on him. What she did was she paid for him to go to Belfast and to learn to be a carver. And he then learned to be a carver, and they then moved to Ballycastle, where he started writing songs. And of course, the most famous song from this part of the world is the Old Atmosphere, and that's what they penned.
So he paid dearly for his
yes,
boyhood games, didn't he?
And
really?
it did, and it very much started with this bridge, I suppose, because otherwise he probably would have went into the family farm or working in the farm here locally, you know.
I presume that put an end to the jumping off the bridge.
It did.
Do you think?
It did, anyway.
So he was Henry.
Yes.
Right? But
yes.
no connection with Henry behind us.
No,
here.
and yet it's just, there is Macaulay, is also a well-known family name here in the Glens, and I mentioned earlier this before the bridge, of course, people would have physically crossed the river. There is places where you can, but one of the most famous, I suppose, places here within the Glens is Henry Step, which is literally just behind us.
So where did the Henry of Henry Step originate? Is that a different man entirely? Yeah.
Yes, it is, completely. And I was saying earlier, before the bridge, the only way for people to get across was, of course, literally to physically across the river, where it was shallow. But he was in a rush somewhere, and the story goes that he decided he would cross just where this waterfall is, and he slipped anyway and fell in and drowned. And that's where he gets his name from.
So both these places at the end of this beautiful pool are named after tragic accidents, really.
Yes, they are too. But what was interesting too, like I said, beautiful waterfall, and if you go further up you see the water coming down to it. But even in Victorian times and later, I have came across lots of old photographs of kind of people coming and looking at it and wearing their top hats. It seemed like kind of a place for people to come and visit and stand beside. And also just with the light, hitting on it, I think it's just a magical place. It's very special to people in the Glens, and I suppose personally it's very special to me. I just love coming down here to explore around it.
Nearby Henry's Step, on the banks of the pool in which Niall and I were standing, I noticed attached to some of the tree trunks what at first glance I took to be nesting boxes. They are in fact feeders full of nuts and seeds. And whilst opportunists like pine martens and grey squirrels will gladly help themselves, the food is intended to be exclusively for the red squirrel, regarded by many local people as the iconic native species of the Glens of Antrim. So concerned are such local people about its continued survival here that they formed the Glens Red Squirrel Group, a bunch of hardy volunteers who dedicate considerable time and energy to protecting and increasing the red squirrel population throughout the Glens. And it's not only extra winter feeding that the group tried to provide, it's extra habitat as well, which explains why Daniel McAfee and I are digging holes for Scots pine saplings on the steep banks of the Glenshesk River.
For every hazel rod we see there's going to be a tree planted.
There will be, and we haven't completed the hazel rods yet, but that's going to be a starting point, and over the next month we're going to get a few trees in.
So this is the wheat pine that we're going to put in, and you've chosen these because you think these are going to be suitable for the squirrels?
They will be. Pines, red squirrels favour the pines, they do.
Right.
Grey squirrels, they favour more the smaller seeds like the oak and that. So we're mainly putting in pines to sort of direct it at the reds.
Do you have greys and reds here at the moment?
At present, we don't.
Right.
We have removed any greys that were
So you're culling the
We
greys?
we actively do grey squirrel control.
And you have to get rid of them because really they'll wipe out the reds eventually.
We do. They have a big impact on not only red squirrels but on other natural species that are here, songbirds.
Because they don't really belong here.
No, they're an invasive species.
All right. Well, will we make a start and get this one onto the ground?
Yes.
Is there any particular choice?
No, you're the privilege of planting the first. So
Am I allowed to choose my own site? I want a particularly soft, easily dug bit of ground.
No, that's not a problem.
All right. So I don't know. What about just this wee one here?
No, that's
right
fine.
beside us. All right. There we go. Well, hold on to that for the moment. All right. Well, tell me this. What was it about squirrels that you in particular, I know there's a group of you now here.
There are.
I mean, they are completely natural to here. There were
are.
always red squirrels
There
here.
has always been red squirrels in Northern Ireland.
But you were saying to me, you met a farmer
I did.
recently
Well,
who's lived here all his life.
he did,
And what was the crack again?
I was walking along the edge of his field next to the forestry that's just adjacent to his property, and he stopped me and he says, "What are you after?" And I says, "Well, I'm after red squirrels, just to look, to see what the population's like here." And he says, "Well, you're in the wrong country, son." I says, "Do you think so?" And he says, "Oh, I've been here since a boy," he says. And so
This was an elderly man.
This was a man, and his 80s, an elderly farmer.
Get away.
And I says, "Have you got 20 minutes?" He says, "I do." So he came into the field with me, we walked through the planting, we sat down where we had a couple of feeders, and within 10-15 minutes we had 2 red squirrels came down the tree, feeding on the box.
And they were the first.
And he sat beside me, and I looked, and his mouth was open, and we sat for half an hour watching them. And I says, "Well, what do you think of that?" He says, "Did you bring these here?" And I says, "No, I did not, sir." So that was his
But
first.
isn't that extraordinary?
And he said there was no problems with me using his ground or coming up through his property to feed the squirrels.
He was charmed
He
with
was
the
more than glad to have me.
Anyway, is that deep enough?
That's
Maybe too deep, is it?
No, that's fine. We'll get her dropped in.
Of the hundreds of trees the Glens Red Squirrel Group intended to plant on this bank, I can only lay claim to have planted 3 before Daniel and I trekked off to replenish some of their feeding boxes. Most of the pictures of squirrels that you've seen up to now have been captured on the little fixed cameras that the group has located at the feeding areas. But Daniel's experience and acute hearing as we quietly approached this stand of Scots pines ensured that I was able to see some squirrels with my own eyes. And I'm quite sure Daniel didn't bring them with him.
That was a real bonus, getting to see an actual. We didn't think it'd see
No,
one.
we didn't know. We were very lucky now.
Yeah.
So we were.
How did you know? Because you heard the wee bird first of all.
I did. I heard the birds, the coal tits would hang around the feeding area because they get any food that the squirrel would happen to throw out of the box. So
they see the squirrel, they get agitated. Is that the idea?
Well, they're sort of wary of him, but they know there's food about and they're fairly active.
What would be the natural predators of your red squirrel, besides the damage that the grey can do to them?
We have pine marten here. Now, the pine marten will eat red and grey.
Right. You couldn't train them to eat only grey?
Well, I wish they would, but...
Do you think those boxes there
Yep.
need replenished then anyway? Okay, here we go.
And so it was on with the task of refilling the squirrel feeders, which, as you've seen, keep lots of other creatures happy as well. The birds, obviously, the grey squirrels, unfortunately, and also, it's wonderful to see, the pine marten, who, when he can't find a squirrel to eat, will just as readily eat the squirrel's dinner.
When it's raining, they climb into the box.
Is that right?
Stay out of the rain.
They use it for a wee shelter?
They well do. Animals aren't stupid.
That's for sure. They won't survive otherwise.
No. Stupidity is a human trait.
Well, squirrels know how to be squirrels, put it that way.
And just occasionally, squirrels know how to be human too. From the newest woodland in the country to the absolute oldest, when we come back. Very much if I'll be around long enough to see the little Scots pines that I planted in Glenshesk grow into any kind of maturity. But the people who planted Breen oakwood further up the glen some 2,000 years ago may well be living there still, because fairies, I'm told, can live an awful long time. The oakwood at Breen is among the oldest, if not the oldest, in the entire country. And the person who's taken on the responsibility on behalf of the Northern Ireland Environment Agency of trying to ensure that it survives for the next 1,000 years is Tracy Platt. One of Tracy's most challenging tasks, I imagine, is persuading people that it really is as old as she claims.
We've had pollen studies done here at Breen, and we know that we've had oak trees here for over 2,000 years. The forest itself was cleared about 2,100 years ago, and again about 1,400 years ago. But it survived in the 17th century when so much of our oaks were lost in Ireland here for barrel making, ship making, tanning, all those purposes. Breen survived, and that's really what is unusual about Breen, is that it is a remnant of what would have been right down the glens here.
So it's truly, truly ancient woodland.
Truly, truly ancient.
And it really hasn't changed all that much in all of that time at all?
It's actually not changed at all. They have also done genetic surveys of the acorns and the trees here, and Breen actually has its own genotype.
Seriously?
Yeah.
You mean these trees are unique to
trees,
this area?
Yeah, probably because unfortunately it is a little puddle with no oaks really within the too close a vicinity to it, and now they're actually their own breed.
Right.
They are sessile oak. I mean, we can recognise them as a breed of oak. They're Quercus petrea, and but they also have their own genotype as well, so it makes it even more important, because...
Preserve it?
Yeah, well, if these prove to be disease resistant and we lose everything else...
This is what an old or ancient oak woodland looks like. It's really constantly renewing itself, is that the case?
It is constantly renewing itself, and really that's a sign of a healthy oak woodland, an ancient oak woodland. You want the mature trees, yes, but equal to that you need the saplings coming through. To allow saplings to come through, trees have to die, things have to fall. So you need the dead wood as much as you need the live wood.
But they're all growing kind of close together as well, and that's where we get all these wee gnarled twisted. But they're all fighting each other for the light.
Well, really, I mean, it's not planted by man, so it's not going to be a nice straight rows. It's not going to be to allow the girths to grow. Really, I mean, the planting here has probably been done by nature. Jays are hugely important in oak woodlands.
Is that right?
Yeah, jays.
Carrying the acorns?
Carrying and burying the acorns. They actually plant the acorns for us.
Right.
So this is where you get this really random distribution where you'll get some close together. You will occasionally get the veteran oaks that you're used to, that you get your arms around, give them a big hug, But you'll have the small spindly ones here as well. Any of the trees that are down, if you get a chance to look at the rings, they're really dense and close together.
They grow. They grow slowly. In other words,
they grow very slowly.
And they don't get big.
They don't get the big girths.
Don't have the room to do that. In other words,
they don't.
And is it true that part of the reason why Breen oakwood has survived is because of the name? The name refers to, I believe, a fairy mound or a fairy palace.
It does, yes.
And people were superstitious about that.
Well, it's Ireland.
It's one theory.
It's Ireland we're in. It's Ireland we're in. Yes, certainly the theory is. I mean, throughout the glens here, you will find fairy trees. You will find standing stones that have no other meanings, and we have the fairy fort here.
So, is the fairies to thank for a lot of it being left alone for so many years?
We do.
Breenwood survives then, courtesy of the fairies and of Tracy and her colleagues, at the southern end of Glenshesk, where the branches twist and turn as they jostle for space on the crowded slopes. Away at the northernmost tip of the glen, however, within sight of the sea, these upright fellows have been allowed to take full advantage of the wide open spaces of the Mahon Temple meadows, overlooked by a house that is unlike any that you've seen further up the glen. It's almost as if two quite separate buildings have been brought together to form one house. And in a strange way, I find that reminiscent of one of the major personalities associated with this house.
You've already heard mention of a number of surnames that have strong associations with the Glens of Antrim. Names like McQuillan, MacDonald, Macaulay, and of course McCahan. But there's another surname that demands to be mentioned, particularly in relation to Glenshesk, and that is the name of Casement. Nearly 100 years after his execution for treason by the British government, Roger Casement remains a controversial figure whose reputation is still in dispute. Depending on your political viewpoint or your interpretation of history, he was either a traitor who got his just rewards for collaborating with the Germans against his own country during the First World War, or he was an Irish patriot who paid the ultimate price for his beliefs. What is not in dispute, however, and what must be to his eternal credit, is the role that he played as a British consul in Africa in bringing to an end the diabolical regime of the Belgian King Leopold II in the Congo Free State in the early 1900s, when whole villages of native people were forced into the harvesting of rubber and were rewarded with systematic enslavement, mutilation, torture and murder. Casement exposed these abuses by spending several weeks travelling throughout the Congo, interviewing workers, overseers and mercenaries, and then publishing his findings, against great opposition as you might imagine, in his report of 1904. Some 6 years later, he did a similar job in the Amazon basin, helping to expose the atrocious treatment of the native Indians by the Peruvian Amazon Company, details of which make for harrowing reading. So a complex and controversial figure he remains. But I couldn't really visit Glenshesk without mentioning his name, because this is where he spent a considerable portion of his formative years. Here in Mahon Temple House, home nowadays of Patrick Casement and his family.
By the age of 13, Roger Casement had lost both his parents, and Patrick's great-great-grandfather was one of the relatives who looked after him while he attended school at Ballymena nearby. He returned here to Mahon Temple quite frequently as an adult, and in fact, it was in this house that he penned his report in the Congo in 1904. Patrick Casement is well used to answering questions about his renowned forebear, but on this occasion, somewhat to his relief I suspect, I'm more interested in his own role in what is called the Heart of the Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme. Patrick is a landowner here in Glenshesk and would have the usual landowner's concerns about the safekeeping of his property. But he's also an ecologist and a keen conservationist who's anxious to provide access to people who share his interest in the natural and man-made heritage of the glens. We're visiting an example of that heritage right now on his land, in the shape of the ancient gable of Culfetrim Church, which is showing remarkable resistance to the gales from which Patrick and I are sheltering in its lee.
And this is older than Bonamargee.
This is, yes, this is late 1400s, late 15th century.
Do we know anything about its history at all?
Very little, except that this is on the site of a much older church.
Right.
And there was a monastic site here, a circular enclosure which is shown by a crop mark that was detected from the air in a dry summer in the 1980s.
Right.
And there was a monastery here with a whole range of associated buildings.
This was a busy place.
This was a busy place.
It's strange now because it's in the middle of this big empty fields, isn't it? And it's standing, it looks strange standing on its own.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, it's a very atmospheric place actually, and I mean, because it's got a great view out over to the sea, to Rathlin, you can see.
On good days.
Well, even today you can now
today,
see it,
yeah,
and a wonderful view up the glen, and it sort of gives you a whole sense of being at the entrance to Glenshesk here.
Now your house, we've just come down from your house, as I say, it's about 2 fields away, it feels more like 2 miles away, but in this weather. But and the name of the house is Mahon Temple.
That's correct.
Which suggests that it was a reference to this church here. The temple was this church.
The church. That's right.
And
yes.
so what, the plain of the temple or something
Yes,
like that?
or in fact, yeah. I mean, the modern townland is now called Church Field, which is more or less a direct translation of Mahon Temple.
living in Glenshesk, in proximity to this, with this beautiful view and all the rest of it, it's hardly surprising that you developed this great interest that you have in conservation and in landscape conservation.
Very much so, yes.
It's a landscape partnership scheme. Explain a wee bit about that.
Well, I mean, this is funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. It's a method of trying to conserve some of these things that we all value so highly, both the scenery, but also the cultural history of the Glens. And I think it's a way of trying to put together partnerships and schemes to do that, involving local people in looking after their own precious environment.
This glen in particular, it doesn't seem to attract the same amount of tourism, for example, as some of the other more promoted glens.
It doesn't, you're right. And I think that's one of the things I think we would all like to do, is to see more sustainable tourism for all of the glens. And I think we're talking really here about activity-based tourism to a large extent, walking, archaeology, natural history, that sort of thing. But obviously one needs to have access to the places like this church.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that we're doing actually in this landscape scheme, is opening a path, some interpretation here for this church.
Unless somebody had told you about this, you're not going to see it from a road or anything at all.
No, it's just off the beaten track. But I mean, I think that's one of the great things about this scheme, and the idea of it is to create beaten tracks, if you like, to places that people wouldn't have otherwise seen and visited and enjoyed.
But it's also important for you to be able to persuade the kind of people who own the land to give the access, that they be assured that people will respect their property and leave things as they found them, etc.
That's absolutely right. I think you've got to ensure that people have that confidence. And one of the reasons I'm keen to do this is to set an example to show that it can be done, because I believe that it is possible. I mean, people should.
Let me ask, what's in it for you personally? Is there anything in it for you personally?
Nothing other than the satisfaction that people will enjoy something that I've enjoyed all of my life, and gain something hopefully from that. It's given me a huge sense of belonging in a way, this, and I would like other people to share that sense that this is very much an organic part of Glenshesk and of the Glens as a whole.